This video is for junior high history. We're covering the highlights from pages 259 to 267. So we're looking at 14.4, Advances for Freedom. Under Operation Desert Storm, highlight George H.W. Bush. And he promised to continue the job that his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, had begun, and he had been Reagan's vice president for both of Reagan's terms. Highlight Saddam Hussein, and highlight that he was the dictator of Iraq, and highlight that he invaded the tiny oil-rich kingdom of Kuwait. Draw a line from that down to the bold term Operation Desert Storm. So this was the battle to stop Hussein and drive him out of Kuwait. And it's now mostly today called the Persian Gulf War. On the second column, highlight General Colin Powell, and highlight that he was placed in command of Operation Desert Storm. At the end of the paragraph, highlight General Norman Schwarzkopf. Got a picture of him there. He's the guy in the camo with the hat on. Highlight that he was appointed to lead the troops into combat. So Powell was kind of the desk guy, and he was the one making the moves and ordering them. Schwarzkopf was the guy who was actually on the ground leading the troops into battle. And this battle was significant because after the failures of Korea and Vietnam, this was the first time since World War II that the U.S. Congress actually followed the counsel of a military commander. So this was finally a war that was thought to be won. Under Invasion and Victory, on page 260, highlight these underlined words. Within just a few days, Kuwait had been liberated, and Saddam Hussein had retreated to a bunker in Baghdad. So this was a huge success. The war lasted only 2.5 months, and that makes it the shortest war that our nation has ever fought. Sadly, though, it proved to be just the beginning of a long struggle against Saddam Hussein. Right, so you can read yourself about the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see a picture there of protesters taking down the statue of Lenin in Russia. Lenin, of course, was the founder of the Soviet Union, first communist leader there. So they tore that down and destroyed it in protest. Right, let's look at page 261. The 20th century comes to a close. On the top of the second column, highlight, during his presidency, Bill Clinton sent American troops to the nations of Somalia, Bosnia, and Haiti. He made some pretty terrible decisions. He worked for more cooperation with Communist China, and he also shared missile technology with them, so handing over very important military information to a hostile communist country. He also hosted a peace talk with Israeli and Palestinian leaders, and this led to an agreement to create an independent Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip and Jericho. Meanwhile, Clinton reduced the American military. So he's giving military information to China to help them bolster their military while reducing the American military. Not a smart choice. And this weakness led to a rash of terrorist activity. In 1993, Islamic terrorists planted a bomb at the World Trade Center, the same one that would later be hit by planes on September 11th. Didn't do a whole lot of structural damage, but it did kill 6 people and injure over 1,000. In 1995, a bomb exploded outside a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City. This killed 168 people. Sadly, this time the terrorist was actually an American, Timothy McVeigh. He was convicted and later executed. So you can see the picture of the building there. He brought up a truck that was loaded with explosives and detonated it in front of the building. You can see the level of the destruction that was caused there. The whole building torn open. Turning to page 262. In the second column, highlight the underlined words. President Clinton became the second president in United States history to be impeached. And this was a result of his general immoral behavior, very unwise decisions, and relationships with a young woman that was an intern in the White House. So all in all, not such a decent guy. Right, the 2000 election was pretty key. Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, was the top candidate for the Democratic ticket. And then President George H.W. Bush, Bush's son, Texas Governor George W. Bush, was the Republican Party nominee. So Bush was advocating compassionate conservatism, and he wanted to cut government aid and allow the American people some more independence in their decisions and their everyday lives. So this was kind of a whole mess. The vote was really close. Each candidate needed to gain Florida for a majority of the votes, and the Florida vote was extremely close. And the Gore campaign questioned the margin. So for 36 days, precincts were recounting their votes by hand rather than using the machines. So on December 12th, the Supreme Court finally ended the recounting, and the next day, George Bush was declared the nation's 43rd president. So the Democrats and the Gore supporters screamed foul on this. I remember it pretty clearly. It was a crazy time. And it was kind of funny how much the people were freaking out. It was a little scary too that it was such a tough call, and so much arguments around it. But later recounts actually verified that Bush did have the majority of votes. There was a lot of miscounting going on. Some precincts were intentionally counting votes for Gore that weren't actually votes for Gore. They were votes for Bush. So it was kind of a whole mess. Unfortunately, early into Bush's presidency, terrorism struck again. So highlight the date, September 11th, 2001, on page 263. And know that this was the deadliest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor back in World War II. And then highlight the bold words, attack on the World Trade Center. So you can see the pictures there. 2 jet planes flown into the highest towers there of the World Trade Center. First plane hit at 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes later, a second plane struck the South Tower. Both towers had collapsed by 10:30, and nearly 2,800 people were dead. Next, highlight attack on the Pentagon. This was the third plane. It killed 184 people at the Pentagon. A fourth hijacked plane was brought down in Pennsylvania. So some passengers on the plane were able to overtake the terrorists in the cockpit of the plane. And they weren't able to fly the plane, but they were able to bring it down in an empty field. And they sacrificed themselves, but they prevented what likely would have been a much greater tragedy. The plane was probably bound for either the White House or Capitol Hill, where Congress meets. Turning to page 264, under the War on Terror begins, highlight, it soon became known that the hijackings were the work of the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. Highlight, war in Afghanistan. So it's billed the War on Terror. Highlight one of the first targets in the War on Terror was the Taliban, and highlight that this was in Afghanistan. The Taliban was a radical Islamic group. They'd taken power in Afghanistan, and they gave shelter and training to Al-Qaeda terrorists. Next, they turned to another known supporter of terrorism, an old enemy, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, same one they fought in the Gulf War. So in the second column, highlight war in Iraq. This was billed Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was intended to drive Hussein from power and help the Iraqi people set up a new government. So there was a lot of violence. In less than a year, however, Saddam Hussein was overthrown and taken prisoner. But insurgents continued to fight. And they killed both American soldiers and their own Iraqi people. Didn't matter to them who they killed. But in spite of all the violence, the first free election in 50 years was held in Iraq in January 2005. So 50 years. Every adult pretty much under the age of like 60 or 70 had never had the opportunity of voting in a free election. And I remember the coverage that was done at the time, and each person had to have their finger stamped with purple ink to show that they had voted. And people were just, they were celebrating in the streets and holding up their stained fingers and celebrating the fact that they'd finally been able to vote in a free election. And that was a pretty incredible thing. Right, page 265, election in 2004. American involvement in Iraq was a huge key issue. John Kerry was promoting ending the war in Iraq, and they had very, very opposing views. Many people predicted a victory for Senator Kerry, but Bush received the majority of votes, and it was not entirely a landslide, which means not like a crazy wide margin of victory, but it was pretty significant. So it very much overturned expectations and was a very good thing. On page 265, second column, highlight the bold words, Katrina was the costliest storm in U.S. history. This was a major, major hurricane. 2004 and 2005 were crazy hurricane seasons. Florida experienced 4 hurricanes in one season in 2004. It was the first time it had happened in 118 years. Hurricanes Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean killed more than 100 people and caused damages of over $25 billion just in Florida. And then in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Most of New Orleans lies below sea level, so there's dikes or seawalls that hold back the ocean. These were destroyed by the hurricane, and much of the city was flooded. In a lot of places today, there's still damage that you can see there, and they're still doing some rebuilding. Property damages were estimated to be more than $100 billion from this one storm. Under Space Shuttle Columbia, highlight tragedy again struck NASA's Space Shuttle program when the Columbia exploded and burned as it returned to Earth. Sadly, it killed all 7 of the crew. Right, and then the last highlight is on page 267. Highlights Barack Obama, the 44th president, became the first black president in our nation's history. The last bit of that is underlined, so highlight that, know that information. Make sure that you thoroughly complete all of your reading, answer your homework questions, and let me know if there's anything that I can help you with.